Is her chat open? Ms. Byram, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
We're gonna drop that menu on the screen so we can see her name.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't need to hit this, but I'll do it anyway. Good afternoon and welcome to the Policy Review Committee meeting. I need to read a statement regarding Mrs. Byram's participation in the meeting, so please listen carefully. Vice Chair Phyllis Byram, who is also a member of the Policy Review Committee, is attending today's meeting virtually. She suffers from a disability that substantially affects a major life activity. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Rehabilitation Act, any board member who suffers from a disability should be given an opportunity to fully participate in meetings open to the public by being provided a reasonable accommodation. This could include an option to participate virtually. Vice Chair Byram has requested this reasonable accommodation under the federal law and is being allowed to participate virtually in today's meeting. Thank you. We're going to begin our meeting with, let me get my little agenda out. A review and approval of the minutes from October 13th, 2022. So, Ms. Byram, if you would review the minutes, and I will.
I've looked at the minutes. Everything looks good to me.
And I have reviewed the minutes and was present and find that there's no reason to disapprove them. So, based on what appears to be unanimous consent, we'll approve the minutes from the October 13th, 2022 meeting. Thank you. We spoke earlier about our need to review our sexual content policy. We had the board look at this policy because it has to be done by January and in place by January 2023. So we had the board look at it as well as the policy committee looking at it, and at this point in time we're going to discuss that particular policy and any concerns that we might have as a review committee before we pass it forward to the board. The board has had, and it has been available to the public to review since last month. The first reading, well, since before last month's meeting. Of course, we post our agenda 7 days in advance. And so the policy was available for review as well as review by the board for the entire month. And we will, of course, have public comments this evening before voting on this policy. Mrs. Byram, did you have any discussion or question about the policy? And that is 8-24.5. Purpose of the policy: definitions, superintendent to develop guidelines for identification, notice to parents, list of sexually explicit materials maintained, and parent right to review materials, defer to parents, and parent may change their decision. Did you have any questions?
I'd just like Attorney Waller, if he's present, to review where we stand item. And I would like him to review a little bit of the history, if he could, for me, of where we have come on this particular item.
I agree. Mr. Waller, would you discuss this for us?
Yes, I will give you an overview of the policy that is currently being proposed as it compares to the model policy that has been presented by VDOE. Each local school board is required to adopt policies that are consistent with but may be more comprehensive than the model policies developed by the Department of Education regarding sexually explicit content in instructional materials. On August 4th, 2022, a model policy was issued by VDOE. Guiding principles referenced in the model policy include the following. Number one, protecting the rights of parents to make decisions with respect to their child. Number two, ensuring that parents are not penalized for requesting alternative instructional materials. And number three, school boards' compliance with the Act should not be construed to require or provide for A, the censoring of books in public, elementary, and secondary schools, or B, the designation of instructional materials as sexually explicit based solely upon the sexual orientation of the characters contained therein. The policy before you today under consideration was reviewed by Dr. Gordon, School Superintendent, Dr. Branch, Chief Academic Officer, and Dr. Lawson Davenport, Director of Curriculum and Instruction. Their input was instrumental in the development of this proposed policy, and the proposed policy is consistent with, but more comprehensive than the model policy of VDOE, and takes into account the guiding principles referenced in that model policy. Again, those guiding principles involve protecting the rights of parents to make decisions with respect to their child, ensuring that parents are not penalized for requesting alternative instructional materials, and school boards' compliance that should not be construed to require or provide censoring of books in public elementary and secondary schools, or the designation of instructional materials as sexually explicit based solely upon the sexual orientation of the characters contained therein. The proposed policy adds language that SPS will take reasonable steps in identifying any instructional material that is with sexually explicit content. The model policy places an affirmative duty on local school divisions. If a school division acts in good faith but fails to identify instructional material with sexually explicit content, the school division would have violated the model policy, notwithstanding its good faith efforts to identify instructional material with sexually explicit content. The language that is being suggested requires SPS to take reasonable steps to identify this material. If SPS can demonstrate that its actions were reasonable, there would be no policy violation, even if sexually explicit content was later discovered in instructional material. The model policy refers to all instructional material. In the proposed policy, the word all has been replaced with any. The word all is broad and refers to everything of a particular kind. It refers to all instructional materials, even materials not used for direct instruction. The word any refers to a particular subset. The proposed policy requires that SPS take reasonable steps to identify instructional materials or supplementary materials used in direct instruction that contain sexually explicit content. The model policy does not carve out any exceptions to the definition of sexually explicit content. The proposed policy, however, has two exceptions. The definition of sexually explicit content does not include content that only references sexual orientation or works of art considered by educational professionals to have scientific, political, educational, or social value. The VDOE guidance document specifically provides that the Act should not be used to censor books or designation of instructional material as having sexually explicit content based solely upon the sexual orientation of characters contained therein. This exclusionary language ensures that the policy will not be used to censor books based solely on sexual orientation of characters contained in books. This language also balances pedagogical concerns with sexually explicit content. Under the model policy, library books are considered instructional materials when used for 1, the completion of a project, or 2, part of an academic or extracurricular educational program. This would place an unrealistic burden on school personnel to review every book in its media centers to determine if there exists sexually explicit content. If a student voluntarily chooses a book from the library to complete a project without any knowledge of the classroom teacher, and the library book contains sexually explicit content, SPS would have violated the policy. The review should be limited to those library books assigned by the classroom teacher. In the model policy, there is no requirement for the superintendent to develop guidelines for implementation of this policy. In the proposed policy, the superintendent is required to develop guidelines to assist schools in identifying instructional materials with sexually explicit content. Schools may find it challenging to implement this policy without guidance from the administration. Under the model policy, in determining whether instructional materials contain sexually explicit content, teachers, principals, and division staff are to consider student age and maturity and whether a parent might reasonably consider the instructional content harmful to their child. The proposed language added the words "among other things" when considering whether sexually explicit content exists in instructional materials. This will allow SPS greater flexibility in making this determination and will enable SPS to consider whether the materials have scientific, political, educational, or social value. Also, in place of language found in the model policy which reads, whether a parent might reasonably consider the instructional content harmful to their child, the proposed policy inserts in its place the words, whether a reasonable parent would consider instructional material harmful to their child. This creates an objective standard rather than a subjective standard for this review. When instructional materials are placed on a sexually explicit list, this list is made available to all parents in SPS. The proposed language eliminates the possibility that instructional materials are being placed on a sexually explicit content list because a parent has a heightened sensitivity regarding certain materials, and it also guards against censorship. It is important to keep in mind that a parent can request alternative instructional materials even if the instructional materials do not appear on the list of instructional materials because the materials were not found to contain sexually explicit content. The proposed policy incorporates School Board Policy 10-17.1 and regulations promulgated by the school superintendent. Regulation 2-3.8 provides an alternative assignment when a parent files a complaint challenging instructional materials for reasons other than sexually explicit content. Under the model policy, principals are to maintain a list of instructional materials with sexually explicit content by grade and subject on the school's public website. Language found in the proposed policy, SPS will maintain a division-wide list by grade, subject, and school on the division's website. This is in addition to the list found on websites of individual schools. This will ensure that parents have greater access to the list of instructional materials. With regard to alternative instructional materials, language in the proposed policy clarifies that alternative instructional materials will not include sexually explicit content that the parent finds objectionable. The word shall has been replaced with will. Due to confusion centered around use of the word shall by legal scholars who have argued for the discontinuing of the word shall, the word will has been used in place of shall. It is my opinion that language in this proposed policy is in accordance with the Virginia Code Section 22.1.16.8 and guiding principles of VDOE. Keeping in mind those guiding principles include protecting the rights of parents to make decisions with respect to their child, ensuring that parents are not penalized for requesting alternative instructional materials, and number 3, school boards' compliance with the Act should not be construed to require or provide the censoring of books in public elementary and secondary schools or the designation of instructional materials as sexually explicit based solely upon the sexual orientation of characters contained therein.
Vice Chair Byram, did you have other questions or concerns?
No, thank you, Mr. Waller, for that interpretation and explanation. Very well done. Thank you. That answers my question.
Thank you. And Mr. Waller, I too would add to that I appreciate the fact that we went a little further than the state did with regard to helping people understand what this is all about. Sometimes the legalese are somewhat confusing when it comes to what you're supposed to do. But in essence, as well, I think we need to make the point that parents still have the right to ask for a substitute assignment if they feel that this is something that they don't want their children to be exposed to. So we're not in any way negating parents' rights.
That is correct.
And they just follow the process that is necessary, ask the teacher for an alternative assignment, and children are not penalized in any way or forced to read any materials that their parents feel might be inappropriate.
And that is correct, even if they do not appear on the
list.
sexually explicit content list.
Okay.
And that is one of the reasons why we made it a point to incorporate the school board's existing policy into this policy.
Thank you. So, Mrs. Barham, do you concur that we need to move this policy forward this evening to the board? This will be the second reading on the board, and the board will then be ready to vote on this policy.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Moving on to section 1-5.7, and this is in our notebooks behind tab 2, discrimination declared unfair.
Section 1.1-5.1, it prohibits discrimination based on disability. Also, the creation of an impartial review process for complaints alleging disability discrimination. The goal of these procedures is to protect substantive rights of individuals, to meet due process protections, and assure compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Did you have any questions or concerns? I think the only thing that we changed here would be military status. Is that correct? Am I reading this correctly? And the policy statement, and then as we turn to 1-5.7, discrimination based on disability prohibited, because we did 1.1.
Right, right.
5.7
Correct.
And that would be the language that is changed from is further of the opinion to change to does not discriminate. And then some of the language is changed to individuals on the basis of. And then we read the new caption, the school board has established this policy as a way to provide prompt and impartial review of complaints alleging any action prohibited by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This policy provides an optional resolution procedure for a complainant. The procedure is not a prerequisite before a complainant may directly pursue any other remedy available under state or federal law. However, the policy of the school board is the student's parent/guardian and employees to have, it should be, is for students, et cetera, to have the opportunity to make concerns known to the school board and for the school board to have the opportunity to respond and resolve concerns as rapidly as possible. That's under A, and then you see the changes in B. The addition of B. The goal of these procedures is to protect the substantive rights of interested persons, meet appropriate due process standards, assure the school board compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and provide a prompt, equitable, and impartial resolution of complaints alleging a violation of Section 504. Any person may be a complainant and may file a formal or informal grievance as provided in this policy. Mrs. Byram, do you have any concerns about that one?
No, I think it's very clear.
Okay, we'll move on to compliance officer designated under 504.
Section 1-5.8, designation of a compliance officer to impartially and equitably resolve compliance and ensure compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The compliance officer will receive complaints, will conduct investigations, assess training needs, and will also arrange for training. 1-5.7, 1-5.8, 1-5.9, 1-5.9:1, all of those policies pertain to the compliance officer and evaluating complaints brought under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Mrs. Byram, did you have any questions or comments on those?
No,
Because what we did is amend or change the language in 504 of 5-1-5.8 and then amend 1-5.9, change some language and amend that and amend the next section. And these amendments and changes were needed because, Mr. Waller?
Each local school board is required to have in place policies and procedures so that complaints of harassment or discrimination can be addressed through a grievance procedure. And this outlines that procedure that will be utilized by Suffolk Public Schools in terms of evaluating those complaints and allowing due process protections for those who file such complaints.
Okay. And so this is just the outline, the step-by-step process that people would go. These are the things that people would have to do as they're working through the process. The procedure is outlined here.
Right, that's what 1-5.9 does. It outlines the formal complaint process, how the investigation will be conducted, the action by the superintendent once that investigation is completed, and also it explains the appeal rights of someone if they disagree with that final determination.
Okay. Mrs. Byram, do you have any questions on that? That would be 1-5 through 8, 1-5.8 through 1-5.91.
No. Everything looks according to plan.
We will move on to 1-6.1, Statement of Policy, Harassment Prohibited, School Personnel Defined, and Prompt Investigations Required. We have some amendments, some additions, and some clarification of language.
Primarily, what this revision to policy will do is that it will expand the number of protected groups, harassment based on sexual orientation, gender identity, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, and military status will be prohibited because they are considered to be part of a protected group.
Protected groups, okay.
And that's basically the only change in this.
That is correct.
Oh, oh.
And it outlines specifics with regard to, because we just moved down the language, graffiti containing racially offensive language, and then B, name-calling, jokes, or rumors. In section 5. Then the Title IX information. What the Title IX coordinator will do. Then 3. So would it be 1, 2, and one dash 6.1, and then 2, and then 3? Because there are changes to section 1, but
Are you looking at 1-6.2:2?
and then I just followed the page. We just did 1.1-6.1. Do we want to look at them because we've skipped to 1-6.3, and we can look at that one separately if we want to, and look at 1-6.3. We can come back to that one and
Right.
look at that separately. Are you suggesting that we look at that separately because it's not on there?
Right, why don't we just go to 1-6.3?
Point 3, okay.
And in this policy, the compliance officer not only will investigate complaints of disability discrimination, but also will investigate complaints of harassment that's
Okay.
referred by the Title IX coordinator.
Okay.
And in determining whether harassment occurred, the compliance officer must consider a list of factors, and they include surrounding circumstances, the nature of the behavior, past incidents or continuing patterns, how often the conduct occurred, the identity of the alleged perpetrator in relation to the alleged victim, location, age of the parties, and context in which the alleged harassment occurred. So they are the factors that the compliance officer will consider when investigating complaints of harassment.
Okay. Mrs. Byram, did you have questions regarding that? Those two?
No, no
6 and 5.
questions.
Okay. All right, and we'll move to 1-6.6. And that is compliance officer and alternate compliance officer.
And this policy is being recommended for deletion because it's being replaced by new sections 1-5.8 and 1-5.9.
So that is to be removed and replaced by that item that you just mentioned.
That is
Are the
correct.
ones that we,
Yeah, 1-5.8 and 1-5.9 will replace 1-6.6.
Okay, thank you.
so the compliance officer will replace this one, the compliance officer that we talked about earlier, designated under 504.
Madam Chair, we did not cover 1-6.5 unless there are no questions concerning 1-6.5. That's the appeal to the school board. In the event there's a finding of no harassment and the person wants to further appeal, they can. Or if there is a finding of harassment and the person that is found guilty of the harassment also will be able to appeal any disciplinary action to the full school board as well.
We did not. Let's go back and look at that one. We had a change of language there and additional language. If the superintendent or superintendent's designee determines that prohibited harassment occurred and discipline is imposed, the disciplined person may appeal the disciplinary sanction in the same manner as any other such sanction would be appealed. So that's additional language to section B of 1-6.5. And that's appealed to the board decisions within 30 days under the grievance procedure. I'm sorry, I flipped past that, looking at the compliance officer.
So they have 30 days to determine if they want to appeal it.
Yes, that's correct.
So that hasn't changed.
The time for the appeal has not changed, but the right of appeal is what is new.
Okay.
Since we've looked at 1-6.6, that's replaced by the compliance officer. 504 compliance officer. That deletion of 1 1-6.6. Are we ready to move to 1-6.7? Informal procedure.
Here we find that the word complainant is being replaced with person allegedly harassed in the informal procedure. Compliance officer has been inserted as the person to be contacted if a decision is made to abandon the informal procedure. And we've also added supervisor along with principal or principal designee who can notify the person harassed and the person accused of harassment that the complaint has been resolved.
Okay, so this would help if, of course, the change in the language from principal or principal's designee or supervisor would help if you're in transportation or central office or whatever.
That's correct.
Okay, and you're not under the direct supervision of a regular public school administrator in building administrator. I don't have any questions about that because it's just a change of language.
I have no questions about the change of language.
Now, 1-6.12, abusive work environments prohibited, retaliation against employees who make allegations also prohibited. The definition for abusive conduct seems to be the biggest change. Would you talk about that a bit, Mr. Waller?
Right. Conduct is considered to be abusive when it is severe and causes physical or psychological harm. It can be either physical or verbal. And then you have abusive work environment is one in which abusive conduct occurs. Physical harm is harm that materially impairs an employee's health or body integrity. And then you have psychological harm is harm that materially impairs an employee's mental health. And they are the definitions that are now included in this abusive work environment policy.
Now the question becomes, when it's psychological harm, how do we determine that? Do we have the employee go to counseling? Do we have our school psychologist or someone? We have to have them go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I know that's what this is. It has to be documented by someone. So do we have them go to that person and we pay for it, or what do we do?
The first step is the employee will more than likely be referred to the Employee Assistance Program.
Okay.
And then based on the evidence from EAP, would potentially make a recommendation. The employee also has within their own rights to see any outside counseling or therapy services, and if they have Suffolk Public Schools insurance, that would be covered.
Do you have any questions, Vice Chair Barrow?
No.
Evaluation of the superintendent. It adds language that the superintendent's evaluation will be consistent with guidelines for uniform performance standards and evaluation criteria for superintendents. And I think that's down here, that's the only change.
And those guidelines are recommended by the Virginia Department of Education. Is that correct?
This
That is
what-
correct.
Yeah.
I have no problem with that, no questions.
I attended the new superintendent's workshop, and the only addition that has been made is the one that was made last March and to be amended this year. And, but the scores are still the same. It's just a matter of assigning points to that and taking them away from some other portion. Okay, let's see, 1.85, evaluation of other staff generally, adds language that teacher and principal evaluations will be consistent with the performance standards included in the guidelines for uniform performance standards and evaluation criteria for teachers and principals. Also includes language that evaluations will include cultural competency, which is the additional standard that goes on the superintendent's evaluation. And definitions are provided by the State Department. So the indicators are provided by the State Department. And the additional language has been added to 1-8.5.
I have no questions on that.
All right, the next one is 2.1-3, policy and regulation, defined administration in the absence of policy. Clearly lays out the difference between policy and regulations. The authority to adopt school board policy rests solely with the school board. Regulations are subject to revision by the school superintendent. And they're just here additions and some deletions of language by the superintendent or superintendent's designee. The final authority for adoption rests solely on the school, with the school board. That's in section A. And in section B, regulations are subject to revision by the superintendent, and some language is moved. Section C remains the same. And responsibilities for school board, which creates rights and responsibilities for, is changed to related to the conduct. Do you have any questions or concerns there?
No, no question.
Changes in policy regulations, changes in policy and regulations. Again, 2-1.4, we have changes in language. Unless otherwise specified in the policy, a new or revised policy becomes effective upon adoption. All regulations are developed by and through the superintendent. They are presented to the school board as information items unless the school board informs the superintendent that it wants to act on a specified regulation. That's the change in the language. And I think it clearly delineates the difference between what we do and what the superintendent does. I think that's a good idea. Did you have questions about that one, Mrs. Byron, Vice Chair Byron?
No, no, it's clear.
Section 2-1.4. So we'll move to section 2-2.7. That should be behind tab 20.
Actually behind tab 21.
21, okay. And that is under C, is that correct?
That's correct.
Special committees may be appointed by the chairman or created by school board action. These committees shall be appointed or created for the specific purpose and shall expire upon completion of the assigned task unless school board action authorizes temporary continuance of such committees. And that's under legislative committees, section C. I don't have any particular question about that.
Nope.
In section 2-3.3, closed meetings, motions. Therefore, attendance by non-members as the discussion of medical and mental health records as a basis for going into a closed meeting. Also, any committee of the school board may permit non-members to attend a closed meeting if the non-member attendance is deemed necessary or will reasonably aid the committee in its consideration of the topic for discussion. That's 2-3.3, and the change is 12, number 12, discussion or consideration of medical and mental health records subject to the exclusion in subsection 1 of, it should say subdivision 1, because it has 2 ofs here. Of Virginia Code 2.2-3705.5. And then we have 304. Should that be 304 or 314? 204 or 2 or 14?
Should be 2 or 14. It
2
should be
or
2.
14.
Mhm.
Okay, okay, that's what's here. Okay. I don't think I saw any other. I did. One other under section I, any committee thereof, the school board or any committee thereof may permit non-members to attend a closed session if such persons are deemed necessary or if their presence will reasonably aid the school board or the committee in its consideration of a topic which is a subject of the meeting. Do you have any questions, Vice Chair Barham, about that?
No, no questions.
Okay. We will move on to 2-4.2. Okay. And that's meeting participation by electronic communication. As language provided for in the state code that a member may participate in a public meeting from a remote location when having to provide care for a family member, and this prevents the member's physical attendance at the meeting. Okay. A family member's medical condition that requires the member to provide care for such family member, therefore preventing the member's physical attendance at the meeting. And then, in addition, in subsection D, that says, or 25% of the meeting held per calendar year rounded up to the next whole number, whichever is greater. So this is such participation by school board member by electronic communication means due to personal matter is limited each calendar year to 2 meetings, or 25% of the meetings held per calendar year rounded up to the next whole number, whichever is greater. And then in subsection E, the school board may meet by electronic communication means without a quorum physically assembled at one location when the governor has declared a state of emergency in accordance with Virginia Code 44-146.17 or the locality in which the school board is located has declared a local state of emergency pursuant to Virginia Code 44-146.21, and then under subsection B, the language is changed, address the emergency to provide for the continuity of operations in the school board or the discharge of its lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. And that's under B. And then under B2, language is added, meeting through electronic communication means including video conferencing if already used by the school board, and 3, provides the public with the opportunity to comment at those meetings when public comment is customarily received. So those are the changes in 2-4.2. The rest of the policy is the same. Do you have any questions or concerns about that, Vice Chair Brown? Any questions?
No.
Mr. Wong?
No, that clarifies. Thank you.
Thank you. We're at 2-6.1. Unanimous vote required. Adds language that no votes are taken by secret or written ballot. And that's true. We don't do that. So each school board member's vote on every decision is recorded in the official minutes of the meeting. The meetings of the school board also reflect the method and results of the votes. No votes are taken by secret ballot. Any tie vote defeats the motion, resolution, or issue voted upon. And then chairman is changed to chair. Any question?
No questions on that.
On that one, we'll move to 2-10.3. Professional development activities, FOIA training required, funding requirement, conflict of interest training required, clerk to maintain records, and this adds language that school board members participate annually in high-quality professional development. Each member completes FOIA training. Each member completes training relative to the Conflict of Interest Act, and then finally, the clerk maintains records of the required training. Okay? This is our policy. And then the new language is at the bottom of the page. Members of the school board participate annually in high-quality training and development activities at the state, local, or national level on governance, including personnel policies and practices, the evaluation of personnel curriculum and instruction, use of data in planning and decision-making, and current issues in education as a part of their service on the board. Each elected board member completes a training session on the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, provided by the Virginia Freedom of Information Advisory Council or the board's attorney within 2 months of assuming office, and thereafter at least once every 2 calendar years. Each elected board member completes a training session for local elected officials on the state and local government Conflict of Interest Act, that's COIA, provided by the Virginia Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council, the Ethics Council, within 2 months of assuming office, and thereafter at least once every 2 calendar years. And then C, the school board clerk maintains records of the dates on which each elected school board member completed the required FOIA and COIA training sessions. The records are maintained in the clerk's office for 5 years. Any questions on 2-10.3?
No questions. I think that clarifies, makes it much clearer than the other previous information.
Absolutely. And this is actually free online, I think. The folks who do the training make it readily available for anybody who wants to participate. 3-1.6, the responsibilities of the building principal, budget preparation, implementation of severe weather plans, makeup days, waivers by Board of Education, and the additional language is under subsection D and E. If severe weather conditions or other emergency situations result in the closing of a school or schools, or all the schools in the school division, or in an unscheduled remote learning day for a school or schools in the division, for 1, 5 or fewer, all missed days are made up by adding teacher days to the school calendar or extending the length of the school year. 2, 6 days or more, the first 5 days plus 1 day for each 2 days missed in excess of the first 5 are made up by adding teaching days to the school calendar or extending the length of the school day. If severe weather conditions or other emergency situations result in the closing of any school in the school division and such school has been unavailable to meet the 180 teaching day requirement, the school division may make up the missed teaching days by providing its students with instructional hours equivalent to such missed teaching days to meet the minimum 990 teaching hour requirement. If severe weather conditions or other emergency situations result in the closing of any school in the school division for in-person instruction, the school division may declare an unscheduled remote learning day whereby the school provides instruction and student services that are consistent with guidelines established by the Department of Education to ensure the equitable provision of such services. And then E, the Board of Education may waive the requirement that the school division provide additional teaching days or teaching hours to compensate for school closings resulting from a declared state of emergency or severe weather conditions or other emergency situations under certain circumstances. If the school board desires a waiver, it may submit a request to the Board of Education. The request will include evidence of efforts that have been made by the school division to reschedule as many days as possible, and certification by the superintendent and chair. May we change chair? Because we have chairman there.
Yeah, we can do that.
And chair of the school board, that every reasonable effort for making up lost teaching days or teaching hours was exhausted before requesting the waiver. If the waiver is denied, the school division will make up the missed instructional time. The Board of Education waives the requirement for school divisions to provide. Should it be 2?
I don't
The Board of
think so.
Education waives the requirement that school division, oh, I see, provide additional teaching days. I'd stuck 2 in there and then take it out. Okay. Additional teaching days or teaching hours to compensate for school closings resulting from an evacuation directed and compelled by the governor pursuant to Virginia Code 44-146.010. 2.17 or up to 5 teaching days. If the school board desires such a waiver, it notifies the Board of Education and provides evidence of efforts that have been made by the school division to reschedule as many days as possible, and the certification of the superintendent and chair of the school board that every reasonable effort for making up lost teaching days or teaching hours was exhausted. After receiving such notification, the Board of Education grants the waiver, and there is no proportionate reduction in the appropriation of for educational purposes necessary to fund 180 teaching days or 990 teaching hours shall be proportionately reduced by the local appropriating body due to any reduction in the length of the term of any school or the schools in a school division permitted by such waiver. I left out further. Further, because it didn't make sense when I was reading. Further, the appropriations for additional purposes necessary to fund 180 teaching days or 990 teaching hours shall not be proportionately reduced by the local appropriating body due to any reduction in the length of the term of any school or the schools in the school division permitted by such waiver. Okay. Did you have any questions, Vice Chair Byron, on this one? 3-1.6. Ms. Byron? John, can she hear me? Mr. Littlefield? Okay.
I can hear her flipping her pages. Can you put her back up on the screen just so we can see? She has audio and over there we go.
It froze. Ms. Byron? That's the weather's gotten. Did I see this? Okay.
No, it's no, nope.
Is that one okay? 3-1.6.
No questions, to be clear.
Okay, all right. And then 3-1.12, there's just an addition of language to which the principal has been assigned. And then instead of rules and regulations, it's policies of the school board. And then regulations
Yes.
of Suffolk Public Schools, that's 3-1.2. So it's just clarifying language added there. Principals are to manage their schools in accordance with policies of the school board and regulations of Suffolk Public Schools. Did you have any questions or concerns?
Well,
Okay. We'll move on to 5-2.1, and that's 2. General statement of policy duties of teachers and administrative staff, assessment of suicide risk by qualified professionals, duties of qualified professionals. And the only thing there is an addition of, instead of scope of his is changed to the persons, and then an additional statement that says the superintendent is responsible for developing procedures for such contact that are in accordance with the guidelines developed by the Board of Education in cooperation with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services and the Department of Health as required by Virginia Code 22.1-272.1. Do you have questions or comments? Ms. Byron? Have we lost the sound again?
Correct.
Okay. And then we have the fire drills required, lockdown.
No.
Oh, did you have questions? Oh, okay, when I asked, okay, all right. 5-2.5, we have one thing changing from twice to once. And the number of lockdown drills, I'm just reading this for the public, during the first 20 days of school is being reduced from at least 2 to once. Okay.
No.
All right. We have 5-4.5, special use of school buses. Additional language has been added that permits the use of school buses for extracurricular activities. That's the only addition. Do you have questions or concerns? Mr. Lady?
No.
Okay. And then lastly, section 5-6.3.
Question.
I'm sorry, did you have a question? It's still just breaking. Okay. 5.6-3 clarifies anyone using the division's computer system must adhere to technology use guidelines established by the superintendent. The superintendent is responsible for reviewing those guidelines every 2 years. The school board will review the policy every 2 years. That's the change, and the language is changed in subsection B, and the technology use guidelines established by the superintendent, and C, the superintendent is also responsible for reviewing and updating as necessary the guidelines at least every 2 years. That's the only change in the existing policy. Did you have
Question.
Okay. All righty. Then we are done. Okay. Now, I have not been, there's been no indication that you haven't informed me of any business that you want to discuss other than this, Vice Chair Byram, but if you have had any thoughts about other things you wanted to discuss, please do so now.
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if you want to go back and look
I
at,
don't have any concerns.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you want to go back and look at tab 7. That's policy 1-6.2:2. That was inadvertently not included in your list of policies to be reviewed, but if you want to review that, you can, since it's also in your book of policies.
Would that be okay to do?
That's tab
Since this
7.
wasn't, would that be okay to do since it wasn't on the list?
Was it on the,
It's not on this list.
It's on the,
It's on this list, but it's not on
but it was on the agenda.
the agenda,
It
yes.
was on the agenda to be reviewed.
Okay. No, not a problem at all. That was the one that I was talking about, the consent, when I asked you
Right.
to clarify. We went through it. Okay. So 1-6.2:2, definitions or examples of certain prohibited conduct, additional prohibited conduct, complaint procedure. And that was what I was asking. We talked about consent. The compliance officer is the person designated by the school board to receive complaints of harassment referred by the Title IX coordinator and oversee investigation of those complaints as described below. Consent is clear, unambiguous, and voluntary agreement between the participants to engage in specific sexual activities. And then that's the definition of consent when we talk about consent. And then item 1 through 3, items 1 through 3, and subsection 3, an employee of the school board conditioning the provision of an aid, benefit, or service of the school board on an individual's participation in unwelcome sexual conduct. 2, unwelcome conduct determined by a reasonable person to be so severe, persuasive, or objectionably offensive that it effectively denies a person equal access to the school board's education program or activity. Or 3, sexual assault as defined in 20 U.S.C. United States Code 1092 F 6A5, dating violence as defined in 34 U.S. Code 12291A10, domestic violence as defined in 34 U.S. Code 12291A8, or stalking as defined in 34 U.S. Code 12291A30. And then under section B, the last line of the of B, first paragraph, regardless of whether the personal characteristic is protected by law, then language, additional language, Title IX means 20 U.S. Code 1681 through 1688 and the implementing regulations. Title IX coordinator means the person designated by the school board to coordinate its efforts to comply with its responsibilities under the policy in Title IX. The Title IX coordinator may be contacted at whatever address we give them at this time. Title IX coordinator in all caps at spsk12.net. In section C, the change is Title IX coordinator rather than compliance officer, and that's been changed. And any complaint that involves Title IX coordinator should be reported to the superintendent. The complainant or person allegedly harassed, we talked about that, and this is in subsection C. After receiving a complaint, the Title IX coordinator makes an initial determination whether the allegations may be sexual harassment prohibited by Title IX. If they may be, the Title IX grievance process below is followed. If they cannot be sexual harassment prohibited, if they cannot be sexual harassment prohibited by Title IX, then the complaint is referred to the compliance officer who follows the procedure below. The Title IX coordinator also determines whether the alleged harassment may also constitute criminal conduct and ensures that law enforcement officials are notified if necessary. If the alleged harassment may also constitute child abuse, then it must be reported to the Department of Social Services in accordance with Policy Section 9-20.13 regarding child abuse and neglect reporting. So those are the changes and amendments to Policy 1-6.2:2. Definitions and examples of certain prohibited conduct, additional prohibited conduct, and complaint procedure. Did you have any questions or concerns? Because I talked about this before. I was supposed to talk about it. So now that I'm supposed to talk about it, do you have any concerns, Ms. Byram?
No, no concerns. I
Okay.
think it's very clear.
Okay. With the exception of the sexual harassment policy, as I explained when the meeting began, this will be the second reading for the sexual harassment policy. Sexually explicit, sorry about that. Sexually explicit material. I'm not reading, I need to read instead of talking off the top of my head. Okay. The policy of policies in Section 8-24.5. We must vote on that tonight because it has to be in place in January. The other policies that we reviewed today are up for a first reading. So everyone will have time to look at these. They have been available to the public, been made available to the public as our policy handbook is on our website, and made available these policies as people have gone to the electronic school board and gotten materials for tonight. So those things are available to everyone. But the only policy that will be up for vote tonight and for its second reading would be Section 8-24.5, and that's sexually explicit materials, the policy regarding sexually explicit materials. Okay?
All of the other policies will appear for first reading in January.
Okay.
They will appear in first reading in January.
Okay.
And then second reading
In
in
February? Okay, good. All right.
And we're also looking to have another policy review meeting on the
In
14th.
December. Uh-huh. On the
At which
14th.
time we may have another set of policies that will also roll over for first reading in
January and
January.
February. Okay, all right. Wonderful. We'll get through it on time. Okay, if there's no business, Mrs. Byram has indicated she doesn't have any, and I don't have any. Then I think by unanimous consent, Ms. Byram, we can close this meeting.
Yes,
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
thank you.
Thank you.